on the question of Carl, I was in his home several years ago. Believe it or not, I was asked to speak at Cornell University. I'd spoken there before, many years earlier. And Carl, give him credit, came to my lecture. We met for just a few minutes, and there wasn't time for us to get together. I was in the middle of my longest tour, 25 lectures in 35 days in 15 states. That's work, you know, if it's Thursday, I'm in Georgia kind of thing. And so he would come to my lecture, but he didn't think that was the time for us to get into it. He wouldn't say anything. And so he was good as his word. He did come that time. Okay, 20 years later, I'm back there again. I'm asked by the advisor to the Cornell University UFO Club, who's a professor in the astronomy department, a generation younger than Carl and I. And so he picked me up at the airport, and we went to Carl's house. And I got cookies and coffee. His wife was there. You know, old times and so forth. And it was interesting. Then he couldn't come to my lecture. He was busy in the middle of a space program that he was the advisor on. And I don't blame him for that. But we had a long discussion. He couldn't understand. He knew my education because we'd been classmates for 3 years. How could we come down on opposite sides of the fence? And I give him credit for doing more than anybody else to get people interested in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But I'll give him blame for putting out more balderdash about flying saucers than anybody, having a bigger influence because he had a bully pulpit with the Cosmos series and with Johnny Carson and, you know, the pop stuff. There were some scientists who resented that, but that's not my complaint. My complaint is he was not objective, he wasn't aware, he wasn't knowledgeable, and all that sort of thing. One of the things we had a discussion about was he was talking about science, the essence of science is reproducibility. He was also talking about he wanted video from somebody who'd been taken on board a saucer, asking for the impossible. You know, it's like asking a rape victim to get name, rank, and serial number of the rapist. Oh, would you sign my autographed book? You know, that's ridiculous. But reproducibility. So as it happens, we each wrote each other. Stuff crossed in the mail about 6 weeks later. We've been busy. Each of us have been busy. Thanked him for the hospitality. And he sent me a copy of a letter, of an article he prepared for Parade magazine. It's a Sunday supplement which gets read by 60 million people or more, about UFO abductions. This was a draft of one of my comments. Turns out he'd sent it to about a dozen people. Turns out I gave the longest comment. I did 12 pages. You said this when in fact that kind of thing. But I also included in this separate letter before I got this article, I had to point out to him that there are 4 different kinds of science. Reproducibility is one. Yes, it's very nice if you can set up an experiment in your laboratory, describe the equipment, publish an article, and somebody somewhere else doing the same things will get the same results. That's an important part of science. There's nothing wrong with that. I like doing that myself. There's a second kind of science where you can predict but can't control. Eclipses are a good example of that. If I tell you, you know, that sometimes the Earth comes between the sun and the moon and makes the moon dark, you say, I don't believe that. I'll bring a camera at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Well, I can't make it happen. I can be prepared because I can predict where I have to be in order to observe it when it happens. Or better yet, when the moon comes between the sun and the Earth and it gets dark down here pretty quickly, a swath. But I can't control it. I can observe it scientifically, make measurements if the weather's clear and all the other nice things. There's a third kind of science where you can't predict and you can't control, but you can hope to make observations. 2 examples, earthquakes. I have a friend who predicts them fairly closely, but not really well. So you can say at 5:17 at this location it'll be a magnitude 6 quake. That we're not yet there. We may get there sometime by understanding more what happens. When I was at the University of Chicago, we had a block of nuclear emulsion. Particles go through it, they leave a path, and you can determine what kind of particles are there. We had one ready to go aloft on a balloon whenever certain detectors said there's a solar storm going on, because it lasts for quite a while. It takes radiation a while to get here from the sun. And people dash out to Stagg Field. They didn't play football there, but that's where they had the first nuclear chain reaction. They launched this balloon. You can't predict, you can't control, but you can be ready to monitor as appropriate. And finally, there's a fourth kind of science. That's the kind of science that involves activities that involve people, beings, intelligent creatures. Debatable maybe, but murder, automobile accidents. We know they're going to happen. In the United States, in a typical year, 35,000 to 40,000 people get killed in an automobile accident. But you're not going to set up television cameras at every corner because you don't know when, you don't know where. You can hope that after the accident you measure the tire skids. You can do all kinds of things afterward. But you have no control over the situation. You got to make do. Airplane crashes. You reassemble the whole darn wreckage in a hangar and you try to figure out what happened. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't. It takes an awful lot of work, but you can approach it scientifically. UFO sightings fall in that last category. We're talking about human behavior. And reports observations by people, generally speaking. Now, I happen to know a criminal court judge, 20 years. More than 90% of cases, he had to make the decision, not a jury. And what does it depend on? Rarely physical evidence, DNA. I mean, DNA is nice in those cases where it applies, but bank robberies and so on, there's no DNA involved. You depend on testimony from witnesses. You have to be able to sort out who's telling the truth, who isn't. And people's lives can be totally changed by this. If he says you're guilty of murder, you may be sitting in jail for the next 30 years, kind of thing. So we have a whole system that's built on evaluating testimony. And he pointed out, demeanor doesn't mean anything. There are people who speak very haltingly and are telling the truth, and there are very glib people who are lying through their teeth. You've got to get other evidence to find it out. And we notice that there are different standards between criminal courts and civil courts. Preponderance of the evidence versus beyond a reasonable doubt. There's two different standards. Okay, when we're talking about UFO sightings, we can learn something here. If a guy says it was moving 1,000 miles an hour and stopped dead, now whether it was moving 800 or 1,200 miles an hour, doesn't matter. And if it stopped dead, maybe it was still moving 10 miles an hour. It doesn't matter. You've still described something that's outside the normal flying thing. If you got a witness to a bank robbery and he says, well, he was probably 60 inches, or let's say 6 feet tall, 72 inches, plus or minus 20%. And he weighed 175 pounds, plus or minus 20%. Well, that's not useful information. You've included most of the population. So you need really good data for that situation. But if you're talking about a saucer making a right angle turn, stopping dead, and no sound, so maybe his hearing isn't very good, but it's certainly different from a conventional airplane. And so we have to be rational in what we demand of our case.